Florida just crossed 23 million residents. More people moved there during the pandemic than to any other state. By every visible metric, it looks like America's greatest growth story. But domestic migration into Florida collapsed 88% between 2023 and 2025. The state that everyone was moving to quietly became a state people are reconsidering. The problem is not the economy, the politics, or the weather. The problem is underneath. Literally. Florida is built on porous limestone, dissolving wetlands, and a coastline that is slowly losing its ability to drain. The state looks like it is thriving. The ground beneath it says otherwise. Built on the bones of an ocean. To understand how Florida got here, you have to understand what the state is actually made of, and why developers, insurers, and lawmakers all ignored the same warning for decades. If you want to understand how geography shapes where Americans live, subscribe. Florida is not solid ground the way most states are solid ground. It is a limestone platform, ancient coral and shell compressed over millions of years, sitting barely above sea level. The highest point in the entire state is 345 feet. Most of South Florida sits under 10 feet of elevation. For comparison, a 2-story house is taller than the land it sits on in much of Miami-Dade County. But elevation is only half the problem. The bedrock itself is riddled with holes. Limestone is not granite. It does not repel water. It absorbs it, it channels it, and it dissolves around it. Over thousands of years, slightly acidic rainwater has eaten through the rock, carving out underground cavities, channels, and voids. When the roof of one of those voids collapses, you get a sinkhole. Florida averages thousands of sinkhole reports per year. Entire houses have disappeared into the ground. Swimming pools, driveways, and sections of highway have been swallowed in minutes. The land that looks stable on the surface is honeycombed with emptiness below. This means water does not just flow over Florida's ground, it flows through it. That single fact changes everything about how the state interacts with the ocean. You cannot build a seawall and call yourself protected. The ocean does not need to come over the wall. It comes under it, through the rock itself, rising into basements, contaminating freshwater wells, and undermining the drainage systems that keep entire neighborhoods from flooding. Most coastal defenses in the world assume solid ground beneath them. Florida does not have solid ground. It has a sponge, and that sponge is slowly filling from below. Over 31% of the state's land area is classified as wetlands. These are not empty swamps waiting to be developed. They are Florida's natural flood defense. Sponges that absorb storm surge, filter water, and slow runoff before it overwhelms streets and canals. But Florida has been paving over them for decades. Development in wetland areas has increased by 19%, and the state recently took over its own wetland permitting from the federal government, loosening the rules even further. Every acre of wetland that disappears is an acre of flood protection that does not come back. And the consequences of losing that protection are not theoretical. They already have a body count. At 1:22 in the morning on June 24, 2021, Champlain Towers South in Surfside, Florida collapsed in seconds. 98 people died in their beds. There was no hurricane, no earthquake, no dramatic warning. A 12-story beachfront building simply fell down in the middle of the night while families slept. Security cameras captured the moment. One section of the building pancaked downward, then another. Concrete floors folded onto each other like a stack of cards. Rescue crews spent weeks pulling through the rubble in the Florida heat, looking for survivors they would never find. The investigation, still not fully closed as of 2025, with NIST expecting to conclude in 2026, has narrowed to construction-related failures, degraded concrete, chronic water intrusion, insufficient structural maintenance over the building's 40-year life. Salt air, moisture cycling through porous ground, standing water in the garage contributed to the slow, invisible damage that Florida's environment inflicts on structures. That damage had been documented in engineering reports years before the collapse. Those reports recommended urgent repairs. The repairs were delayed. The building could not wait any longer. Surfside was not just a tragedy, it was a trigger, and the consequences that followed may end up reshaping Florida more than the collapse itself. The bill that came due. After Surfside, Florida passed new laws requiring older condos to undergo structural inspections and, critically, to fully fund their reserve accounts for future repairs. That second part is the one that detonated. For decades, condo associations across the state had been deferring maintenance and keeping reserves artificially low to keep monthly fees affordable. It was an open secret. Everybody knew the buildings needed work, but nobody wanted to pay for it today. The new rules forced the real costs into the open. Suddenly, condo owners across Florida were hit with special assessments of tens of thousands of dollars. Some buildings needed millions in repairs that had been postponed for years. Owners who had bought affordable units in older buildings, many of them retirees on fixed incomes, found themselves facing bills they simply could not pay. The condo market in much of coastal Florida shifted almost overnight. Units that were once the affordable entry point into the state became financial liabilities. Some owners tried to sell and found no buyers willing to inherit the assessment. The post-Surfside rules did not cause the problem. The deferred maintenance was always there, hidden inside the walls and under the parking garages. The laws simply made the hidden costs visible. And that visibility changed who could afford to stay. But the condo crisis was just one fracture in a much larger break. The insurance spiral. The bigger fracture, the one affecting every homeowner in the state, is insurance. And this is where Florida's problems stop being local and start becoming a national case study. Florida's average homeowner insurance premium reached roughly $3,747 by mid-2025, nearly 3 times the national average. Multiple insurers have pulled out of the state entirely. Others have stopped writing new policies in coastal zones. The state-backed insurer of last resort, Citizens Property Insurance, has ballooned in size, absorbing risk that private companies refuse to carry. Citizens was designed as a safety net for people who could not find coverage anywhere else. It was never meant to be one of the largest property insurers in the state, but that is exactly what it has become. Homeowners who can still get private coverage are paying more every year. Homeowners who cannot are stuck in a trap, unable to sell a house that no one can insure at a reasonable cost, unable to afford to stay. Think about what that means in practice. You own a home worth $300,000. You want to sell it. But the buyer cannot get an affordable insurance policy, which means they cannot get a mortgage, which means they cannot buy. Your home is worth what someone can finance, and if they cannot insure it, they cannot finance it. The value evaporates, not because of a storm, not because of physical damage, but because a spreadsheet in an underwriter's office said the risk is too high. Insurance is the mechanism that connects geological risk to everyday life. It is not dramatic disaster footage. It is a monthly bill that grinds people down, quietly, relentlessly, until the math stops working. Growth eats its own foundation. Here is where all the threads converge. Florida's growth model has always worked like this. Attract people with sunshine, low taxes, and cheap land. Build fast. Expand outward. Keep the economy running on construction, tourism, and real estate. But that model requires 3 things to function: cheap insurance, working drainage, and land that can actually support development. All 3 are now under pressure, and they reinforce each other in a vicious cycle. When wetlands are paved over, flood risk increases. When flood risk increases, insurance costs rise. When insurance costs rise, affordability drops. When affordability drops, migration slows. When migration slows, the construction-driven economy weakens. The very growth that made Florida successful is now undermining the systems that made that growth possible. The engine is consuming its own fuel. A Florida Atlantic University study estimated that just 6 more inches of sea level rise could cripple roughly half of South Florida's flood control infrastructure. That is not a distant scenario. Sea levels have already risen about 8 inches since 1880, and the rate is accelerating. The drainage canals and pump stations that keep neighborhoods dry were designed for a coastline that no longer exists. They were engineered for a water table that sat comfortably below street level, but that table is rising, and every inch it climbs reduces the system's ability to move water out before it reaches someone's living room. In parts of Miami-Dade and Broward counties, king tides already push water up through storm drains and onto streets on sunny days. Not during hurricanes. During clear weather, with no rain at all, the ocean simply rises through the infrastructure designed to keep it out. And the damage is not only structural. The water you drink. In 2021, the state approved the emergency release of 215 million gallons of contaminated wastewater from Piney Point, a former phosphate mining site, directly into Tampa Bay. The release intensified concerns about red tide, toxic algal blooms that kill marine life and can cause respiratory problems for people on shore. Residents along the coast watched dead fish wash up in numbers that turned beaches gray. But Piney Point was not a freak accident. It was a symptom. Florida's water infrastructure, including the wells, the treatment plants, and the drainage networks, was built for a state with fewer people, less pavement, and a higher water table margin. That infrastructure was designed in the mid-20th century, when South Florida had a fraction of its current population, and the water table sat comfortably below the surface. The engineers who designed those systems assumed certain conditions would hold. Those conditions no longer hold. Every new subdivision adds impervious surface and runoff. Every lost wetland reduces natural filtration. Every inch of sea level rise pushes salt water closer to freshwater supplies. In a state built on porous limestone, there is no underground barrier to protect drinking water. The same geology that lets the ocean seep under seawalls lets salt water migrate laterally into the aquifers that millions of people depend on for every glass of water, every shower, every irrigated lawn. The water beneath Florida's cities is under the same pressure as the buildings above it, and unlike a building, you cannot inspect an aquifer and schedule repairs. Two Floridas. The result is a state that is splitting into two populations. Wealthy buyers, many paying cash, many from out of state, continue to purchase high-end properties in desirable areas. They can absorb insurance costs. They can fund condo reserves. They can afford to rebuild after storms, hire private flood mitigation, and wait out a bad year. For them, Florida still works. The sun still shines, the beaches are still warm, and if the insurance bill doubles, they write the check. But middle-class and working-class residents, the people who run the tourism economy, staff the hospitals, teach in the schools, drive the buses, cook the meals, are being squeezed out by the compounding costs of living in a state where the ground, the insurance market, and the infrastructure are all working against affordability. A hotel housekeeper in Fort Lauderdale does not have the margin to absorb a $4,000 insurance premium on top of rising rents and property taxes. A retired teacher in a 1970s condo tower cannot write a $50,000 check for a structural assessment that was deferred before she even moved in. The domestic migration numbers tell the story. The flood of new arrivals has slowed dramatically. The people who are leaving are not making headlines. They are just quietly not renewing leases, listing homes at a loss, and driving north to Georgia, the Carolinas, or Tennessee. The state's population is still growing, but the character of that growth is changing. Florida is becoming a place that selects for wealth and filters out everyone else. The sunshine is still free. Everything else costs more every year. The warning for everyone else. Florida is not unique. It is just first. Every coastal state in the southeastern United States faces some version of the same equation: rising seas, aging infrastructure, insurance market stress, and development pressure on vulnerable land. The Carolinas, Texas, and Louisiana are all watching Florida to see what happens when these forces converge in a state with 23 million people and trillions of dollars in coastal property. But the lesson from Florida is not that rising seas will destroy coastal cities. The lesson is subtler and more important. The destruction does not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrives as a monthly insurance bill you cannot pay, a condo assessment you did not expect, a drainage system that fails on a Tuesday afternoon in a rainstorm that would have been routine 10 years ago, a well that starts tasting like salt. It is not a hurricane that empties a neighborhood. It is the slow accumulation of costs that make staying there no longer worth it. Stand on any beach in South Florida and look inland. You see condos, palm trees, traffic, restaurants, life. Everything looks normal. But beneath your feet, the limestone is dissolving. Behind the seawall, the water table is rising. Somewhere in Tallahassee, a developer is filing permits for a new subdivision on former wetlands. Somewhere in Miami-Dade, a homeowner is opening an insurance renewal letter and doing the math that does not work. Florida did not choose to be fragile. The geology chose it millions of years ago. What Florida chose was to build as if the geology did not matter. And now, quietly, the ground is sending the bill. The question is not whether Florida will change. It is whether the people who built it will notice before the people who live in it cannot afford to stay.